We'll take a look at some interesting ways to blur the lines between house and garden in this show, coming up next. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to the Garden Home, where we're always exploring ways to create more beautiful outdoor living spaces. Now in today's show, we're going to touch on a few design principles that will help us blur the lines between exterior and interior. We'll be looking at some ways for you to enjoy the exterior of your home even more and bring the garden inside as well. We'll also have a look at some of the design principles that I use to create a garden, principally enclosure. It's one of the most important. We'll take a look at shape and form, which challenges the way we look at plants in our garden. And then we'll talk about screening views, which helps us to create privacy in gardens. We've got a full show ahead, so let's get started. This idea of enclosure plays a vital role in my garden and the other gardens I've designed. You see, I use man-made objects like this picket fence to help enclose parts of my garden. I also use plants. Growing along my fence are roses and viburnum. In the spring, this corner of my garden is very much alive with bloom. During the fall, goldenrod and salvia start to steal the show from other parts of the garden. This goldenrod, called Fireworks, looks great between the sidewalk and fence. Clipped hedges like this needlepoint holly hedge play such an important role in the overall framework of my garden. And believe it or not, the winter is probably the best time to examine evergreen enclosures because you can truly see how these plants provide structure or bones to a garden. Now you may be thinking, it must have taken forever to grow a hedge like this. Well, actually it grew rather quickly. When I laid out the garden, the plants were very small, just 3-gallon pots placed about 30 inches apart. But within 5 years, the hollies had grown to about 7 feet. Now these hollies provide the walls to my fountain garden. The fountain garden is just one of the small garden spaces that surrounds my home. I call these small spaces garden rooms. Each room, such as the front garden, the rondelle garden, and the vegetable garden, is a unique space that provides a different experience. Some of the other plants I use to help create walls in the gardens are boxwoods and roses. Now that brings us up to the entry arbor to my rondelle garden. Now I know the rose over the arbor doesn't look like much now here at the end of fall, but you should have seen it last spring. It was covered with flowers. Now this rose is called New Dawn and it's one of the most prolific I have in my garden. Entries are such an important part of a garden home because they serve at least two purposes. The first is that they say welcome to visitors, and the second, well, they direct a person. They tell them where to go. If we don't have clear and direct entries, then visitors arrive and they're confused, they don't know where to go. If that's the case, we've defeated our purpose. That's why I wanted to create a strong sense of entry here on this side of my garden. And I did it with this arbor. Now this arbor may look complicated, but it's actually very simple. Let me show you some of the components and how to put it together. I started with 4 large square posts that support this triangular shaped pediment at the top. Now this bonnet allows the rose canes to rest on it. Now over here on the sides, I've used some rustic timbers in a crisscross design. Now to complete the composition, I placed a gate here in the center and I followed the same motif as I used on the fence itself. You may have noticed I live in an older neighborhood where the houses are close together, so creating a sense of enclosure is very important. It establishes some privacy, and components such as these help us to achieve those goals. Now step inside my garden and I'll show you how I use enclosure in some other ways. Of course, the most obvious example of enclosure in my fountain garden is its walls made of holly hedge, which is quite a literal wall, reminiscent to the walls of a home. But step into my rondelle garden. In the rondelle, we have another type of evergreen hedge, boxwood, but these are grown lower to make the room feel more open. These walls are less literal, but nonetheless very apparent. You might not think of my loggia, or covered breezeway between the garage and house, as a room in the garden, but it actually serves as a very important part of my garden home. One side is open to the rondelle garden, while the other has lattice, which provides support to climbing vines. I use this space in my garden for entertaining, relaxing, working on craft projects, well, just about everything but cooking and sleeping. It's truly an extension of my home. Now, one last word on enclosures. Now, I've given you some examples of what I call more obvious enclosures, using walls, hedges, and fences. But you know, an enclosure can also be achieved in a more subtle way, almost implied. In a garden I designed, ornamental grasses provide a soft, subtle enclosure. Planter boxes, like the ones I've used here on this terrace, establish parameters and also imply enclosure. Remember, enclosures give both privacy and can help define garden rooms. One of my neighbors asked for help when she began to lay out her garden home. Together, we created a plan that she could implement over several years and do the majority of the work herself. Of course, it took a construction crew to tackle the rebuilding of the garage and the apartment above it. Boy, was that a project that really gave the whole garden home a jump start. Just take a look at the patio garden next to the completed garage. This small space is easy to manage thanks to container plantings, a brick patio, and the enclosure that the new garage and this L-shaped loggia creates. Now, sometimes even the best laid plans just don't work out. Let's walk across the street and I'll show you a situation that arose after the garden was already in place. Okay, so here's the situation. About the time this family got this garden room all pulled together, making it very beautiful and comfortable, the neighbor next door had to cut down a large oak tree. Now, this tree had served as a screen between the tall house over here behind me and this space for years. So the solution, well, was to try to plant a screen here. Initially, they tried Leyland cypress, but these cypress really aren't happy because the soil here doesn't drain well, and so the plants constantly have wet feet. So the idea is to take these trees out and put in a species that will perform well in these conditions. My choice is to use a magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, the southern magnolia. Now, I know they can grow to an enormous size, but what I want to use is an improved cultivar called Little Jim. It's actually a dwarf variety, and I think it'll perform beautifully here. The dark glossy leaves will serve as a nice backdrop, and eventually these trees will grow to a height that will give us the screening we need from the tall house beyond, creating the intimacy and privacy we need for this space. During a visit to Chicago one hot summer, when the cicadas were singing in full force, I met a landscape architect who also faced the challenge of screening views when working with a suburban garden home. Claire Kettlecamp worked on the landscape design for this Italian country-style home. The feeling of the home is that of a farmhouse, and Claire has incorporated the casual feel into garden spaces which surround the structure. Now, that's not to say that there aren't formal elements worked in as well. Here you can see a beautiful colonnade with rhythmic columns. A Greek key pattern is created with boxwood and coleus, and a curved path leads visitors to a quiet retreat where they can sit on a bench and enjoy the surroundings. Claire and I climbed to a balcony which overlooks the garden with its round lawn to explore the view further. Now, the staircase, we came off of a landing there that's sort of at an angle, and then we came up the wood staircase itself.
We've changed the orientation of the brick landing.
And now that landing is on axis with the center of the lawn.
That's right. It goes to the center point of the circle, and everything spins off of that point.
So the body of the lawn really is a perfect circle, and then you have this sort of like a tail of a comma going off into infinity.
Yes, we do.
Well, you know, it gives the illusion of making this garden very large and expansive.
Yes, and that's the reason we did it.
Now tell me about the screening that's going on. I mean, it's the way you have blocked the views of neighboring houses is very effective, but it also follows that informal feel.
Absolutely. We've strategically placed some groupings of large evergreen trees. There is a 6-foot-tall masonry wall surrounding the property, but it doesn't hide views of neighboring homes.
Yes, you need something that goes up beyond the top of the wall.
That's right.
Well, it's such a good example of the informal placement of trees and how effective that can be. I think so often we think we have to put a solid screen of something up.
That's right, and you would have no more knowledge that there's a two-story house behind you than just a woodland.
Yeah, very good. And the mixing of evergreens like the white pine with hardwoods is good as well.
Thank you. It's play on texture, just another trick for design.
Well, Claire, this has been such a treat. Thank you for taking the time to share this beautiful garden with us.
You're more than welcome.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Claire and her team certainly came up with some beautiful and creative solutions for that garden. I know many of my clients have expressed how much more they enjoyed their outdoor living spaces once they've added some room-like privacy. So far in today's show, we've talked in great detail about enclosure. We've also seen the importance of accenting an entry. Here's another example, this arbor that leads into my fountain garden. And we've also taken a look at the importance of screening to create privacy and intimacy in a garden space. Now I want to give you one tip on keeping evergreens in tip-top shape. Now when you shear an evergreen hedge like this, you should always cut it on a slight bevel, where the top of the hedge is slightly in and the bottom, well, it's kicked out just a bit. You see, if you let the top limbs grow out and shade the bottom limbs, the hedge will become leggy. And that applies to hedges this tall and even low borders. You know, it's funny how we naturally cringe when it comes to giving our shrubs a haircut. But the thing to remember, on hedges, just cut them on a slight angle, use a nice pair of sharp shears. And in my garden, I shear them twice a year. Once in late winter and early spring, and the other during the summer. And in the fall, I just knock off any of these little radical stems that come about. Now, you know, I took a trip to the Chicago Botanic Garden a few years ago, and I saw how radical pruning was the essence of an ancient art form. Learning to recognize shapes and forms of plants, whether they're natural or man-made, is an important part of the landscape design process. Now, clipped forms such as hedges and topiaries can really add a lot of visual interest, if not whimsy, to a landscape. Then there are man-made forms such as bonsai, which are equally intriguing, evoking great age and mystery. I'm here at the Chicago Botanic Garden, where one of the best public collections of bonsai is housed. Now, as an artist, I've always appreciated the beauty of bonsai, but I've never grown one of these magnificent plants myself. You see, bonsai is the Japanese art of dwarfing trees or plants and developing them into interesting and pleasing shapes. The literal translation from Japanese to English is tray planting. And as you can see, each of these bonsai are potted into containers that are proportionate to the plant, and the material the container is made of complements the planting. Here at the Chicago Botanic Garden, more than 160 bonsai are maintained, and a sample of those are on display throughout the year. Now, contrary to what you may have seen in movies or magazines or books, bonsai are not houseplants and should actually be grown outdoors as much as possible. Let's learn a little bit more about bonsai from Jack Thompson, a volunteer here at the garden. Hey, Jack.
Hey, Alan. Welcome to Bonsai Alley.
Well, thank you. Well, you've got quite a collection here to work with. Well, there's a wide range of plants that can be transformed into bonsai.
Well, any woody plant can become a bonsai if it can look convincing as a tree in a pot. For example, this tiny little Chinese elm here, compare this to the size of the leaf on the elms that we have on our streets. Mm-hmm. But you can see that these are much smaller. They're about, I don't know, what would you say, size of a...
Tiny little mouse ear.
Yeah, tiny little mouse ear. Mouse ear is a key for us in bonsai. You didn't know that before you said that, but when we store the trees for winter, in spring we get very, very anxious to get the trees back out and get working on them, and oftentimes people do it too early. So our key up here up north is to wait until, oddly enough, the oak trees in our neighborhood begin to put out leaves that are the size of a mouse's ear. Part of this is our art, our skill. I have a colleague who says bonsai is theater, and I think there's a great deal of truth to that. It's not a complete misrepresentation, but it's a slight misrepresentation to tell a story. The purpose of these trees as a form of art is to evoke in the mind of the viewer a sense of an ideal tree.
I see, an archetypal tree.
An archetypal tree, or tree that they've known somewhere, somehow, either in imagination or in memory, in reality, that they've encountered. That's the purpose.
This ancient form of pruning reminds me of the design principles shape and form. Let's go back to my garden to learn more. Shape and form in the garden home. Now, what could I possibly be talking about? Well, this principle helps us to look at plants in a more abstract way and how they go together in the garden. For instance, as kids, we always drew trees that looked like lollipops. We were simply distilling the basic shape and form of a tree down to its simplest form. You can use plant shapes to help achieve certain results in the design of a garden. For instance, columnar-shaped plants can imply columns or create a sense of rhythm. How about round shapes, like these clipped boxwoods? You see sphere or globe-shaped plants, like these, are excellent for punctuating entries. Tree roses have a lollipop shape to them, which makes them fun exclamation points in the four corners of my fountain garden. Do you kind of see what I'm talking about here? It's this idea of looking at a plant, not so much about the plant itself, but its overall shape or silhouette. Now, this can be a very effective exercise when trying to figure out what form will work best in a place, particularly when you think about that plant as a mature form. Now, a classic way to have fun with shape and form is to take a look at topiary. Now, topiary is simply the art of clipping plants into interesting shapes. Most of us are probably familiar with topiary that's clipped into geometric figures and the shapes of whimsical animals, like these at Bonsai Gardens in California. Topiary can certainly add a sense of humor to the garden. Now, I've got a project that will allow you to create a beautiful topiary, not for your garden, but for your home. It's a creative way to bring the garden inside. You see, blurring the lines between indoors and outdoors is a key component to the garden home. Creating a fall topiary is one of the best ways to bring the beauty of fall indoors. Now, we're going to create a classic lollipop topiary. That's a ball on a stem. Now, you can use your imagination and use all sorts of things from the garden or the florist. Now, the first thing you'll want to do is create the form, and that will require 3 different elements. You'll need a clay pot. In this case, I'm using a 7-inch diameter terracotta container. You'll need a round styrofoam ball. This is a 6-inch ball. And I've used a bundle of sticks to create the stem. I just used Eleagnus stems and tied them together with some of this jute twine. Now, let's go back to the container for just a moment. You see, when I create these topiaries, I like to use plaster of Paris as the base in the container. But before you pour it in, you need to make sure that you have the drain hole covered. And I like to use duct tape, as you can see here. Now, one of the great things about plaster of Paris is that it's easy to use, it sets up in a hurry, and it's also heavy. You see, these topiary can become top heavy, so you want something substantial in the container to help weight it down. I simply take the bundle of twigs and place them in the center of the container and then pour in the plaster up to about a 1/2 inch to the top of the container. Now, once the plaster hardens, I like to cut off the stem. Now, I want to make sure that I have at least 12 inches of stalk for the little tree, and then an extra 4 inches that can be pressed into the ball. Okay, now's the time for the fun part, where you can really get creative. I use all sorts of things when I create these types of fall arrangements, but the mainstay for this particular topiary is coxcomb. Just look at this, isn't it luxurious? I'm using pieces of coxcomb as well as some of these sunflowers I dried from my garden this past summer. Now, before you get started covering the ball with the coxcomb and sunflowers, make sure you push a hole in the bottom of the styrofoam ball so you can easily slide this over the stalk. Now, to cover the ball with the coxcomb, what I do is I just take some of this coxcomb in small pieces like so, taking Here I've got about 3 together. And I just move the ball over to a place that needs filling, hold it there in place, and then I take these staples, these wire staples, and just push them in to pin the coxcomb to the ball like that. And you can see I'm creating a dense mat. And as you can see, I fill in from time to time with the dried sunflowers. And it's just a matter of pushing those into the styrofoam and securing them with the hot glue. Now it's just a matter of adding other elements. Some of the things that I've chosen out of the garden include this celosia, this wonderful strawberry fields gomphrena, and for a touch of purple I've used this dried Mexican sage, Salvia leucantha. And then for a little textural contrast, I picked up this bittersweet from a local florist. Isn't it beautiful with its orange and chartreuse berries? Now to finish it off, I just added a few red maple leaves, took a few stems of the bittersweet and entwined them around the stalk, and covered the base with some sheet moss. Isn't it amazing what you can find in your own garden and create? This is a wonderful way to bring color into the garden home. So while we're on the subject of being creative, I'd like to focus on one of my favorite things to do in the garden, and that's create containers. In each show, I try to focus on some of my favorite recipes, and I find it's helpful to people who are confused about which plants to choose. And after all, containers will work in just about any size situation. Now back to this idea of plants. If you break the plants down into 3 basic shapes, it's so much easier when you head off to the garden center. Let me give you an example of a container you may want to try. I followed my favorite recipe, which is I start with a plant that's tall and spiky. Next, I fill in the middle with plants that are round and full. And finally, for the finishing touch, plants that cascade or spill over the edge. Here in this container, I've utilized those basic shapes. The tall and spiky elements are tulip Gordon Cooper and pink hyacinth. To fill out the center, we find Nemesia peach sachet and an artemisia called Oriental Limelight, as well as the foliage of foxglove. Now I'd like to go back to a plant that I mentioned in that container. That's Nemesia. It's such an outstanding annual. Just take a look at the one that I planted in this container back in the spring. It bloomed throughout the summer, and now even in late fall it continues to flower. Now back to that container. Besides the peach sachet Nemesia, I also used Calibrachoa. They look like miniature petunias, and because they come in such a wide range of brilliant colors, they're almost impossible to resist. There's actually a group of these beauties called the Colorburst series, and believe me, the name says it all. If you grow Calibrachoa, and I encourage you to do so because you'll be richly rewarded, you need to keep in mind that they'll require frequent feedings in order to bloom profusely throughout the growing season. But hey, if you're planting containers, you should be feeding them at least weekly anyway. Now both Nemesia and Calibrachoa perform in full sun, so I think it's only fair to remind you of a great shade plant for both the garden and for containers. At the top of my list is Impatiens, not just any Impatiens, the Sonic series. If you're looking to give your shade garden a sparkle, then you'll want to check out these large blooms. You see, the Sonic New Guinea Impatiens produce huge flowers up to 3 inches across. In most parts of the country, these warm season annuals will bloom from early summer through the fall. We've really covered a lot of ground in today's show. We've talked about the importance of enclosure, accenting entries, screening views, and even looking at plants in a unique way by boiling them down to their most basic forms. We also took a trip to Chicago, where we saw a beautiful garden home and some amazing examples of bonsai. And don't forget, you can bring the garden indoors with a creative topiary, and you can always heighten your enjoyment of the garden home by filling containers with beautiful, colorful annuals. Until next time, from the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Allen Smith's Garden Home.
Did you know that organic farming is one of the fastest growing sectors in American agriculture? Well, it is. We'll see student farmers in action and learn about organics in California. Get tips on creating safer, more beautiful backyards. See how some plants will help keep bad bugs at bay. It's a show full of ideas and tips that you can apply to your garden home, so don't miss it.